If you have read Atomic Habits or The Obstacle is the Way or any of Seth Godin's books, that's great, good job. But what I'll do in this video is to argue that if you want to get an edge from reading, if you want to get a competitive advantage from reading, what you need to do is to focus on reading older and more uncommon books. If you're new here, my name is Mario, and on this channel we explore life in Denmark, high-stakes productivity, and world travel. In this video, I'll just take an oddball angle into the productivity style. Within my social circles, reading is vogue, it's trendy. More people are reading now than they have ever done. And I think that's great, because the more you read, the better you learn to think, and the better you think, you could also argue that you live better as well. Thing is that within these groups, most people, yes, they're reading more, but they're reading always the same books. So they're reading the Atomic Habits, they're reading Naval Ravikant, they're reading Tim Ferriss, and they're also even listening to the same podcast, Hardcore History, for example. And no doubt that all these materials, all these books and podcasts, they're so valuable. They're full of good insights and full of good information, and that's why people read it, and that's why they get recommended over and over. No doubt about it, I got a lot of value out of them myself. Now, then the key point here, the key thing I want to hammer is that the thing is that if you're reading the same thing everyone else does, you'll have the same insights that everyone else has, and you'll think in the same way that everyone else does. And to get an edge, to get a competitive advantage, what you need to do is look beyond. So just to illustrate this point a bit better as well, is that if you're the 1 millionth person reading the 4-Hour Workweek or Atomic Habits and so on, you'll have the same anecdotes, you have the same stories, you have the same business insights or business hacks and so on that everyone else does. And to get an edge in such a competitive world, to bring new stories into the table, to be a bit of more of a standout, what you need to do is look beyond. You need to look into something that's more different than these books. So my recommendation is, yes, you should read these books that everyone else does, but you need to combine that also with some more uncommon, older, and you could even say more obscure books as well, because that's the places where you'll find the good stories, good anecdotes, good insights that nobody else has, and that's where you can get your competitive edge. Before we deep dive into the obscure books I want to recommend, and also how you find your own obscure books, make sure you click the subscribe button over here. It will be great for me to get more subscribers, to keep motivated to pump out more videos. And now that you're also on it, there's this beautiful like button, smash that as well, so you can help me right through the YouTube algorithm. Thanks so much, and let's continue. Specifically, you should add both depth and breadth to your reading. And let me give you two examples for this. When it comes to depth, now everyone is reading about Stoicism. So if everyone is reading books as a whole, everyone is now even more reading books about Stoicism. So everyone is reading Marcus Aurelius, they're reading Ryan Holiday's books about him and all the other Stoics, they're reading Seneca, they're reading Epictetus. But the reality is that one out of 1,000 people just go beyond these mainstream books. And again, don't get me wrong, these books are amazing. The fact that you have the memoirs of Marcus Aurelius, I mean, it's insane that we have that. I'm so happy that I could actually go and read that book as well. But again, if you want to get an edge, if you want to really know and really get into Stoicism, you need to go beyond that. And for that, for example, one of my key sources for stories and key sources for understanding Stoicism, where the backdrop and where it comes from, was to read, for example, The History of Rome Since Its Foundation by a guy called Titus Livius, who wrote 2,000 years ago. And we still have that book, which is amazing. So, for example, within his long history of Rome, there's a section, and it's a big section, and I'll make a video about it because it's amazing. He talks about the war Rome had with Carthage, with the General Hannibal who crosses the Alps with elephants, that everyone knows, at least the high level of the story. And it's just so incredible that this is a war that every other country, every other civilization would have lost. But the Romans stood up after insane defeats, insane situations. You can't imagine the drama that you see, and you see it all with color in these books. You see anecdotes and moments where you can see, okay, these people are just so tough. So, I mean, as the word comes, so stoic. And that is the background of these Republican wars and the background of this rise of Rome. This is what made Marcus Aurelius sit down and write those memoirs. This is the experience that he had as his civilization, and not, for example, the decadence of what you could call Caesar or the decadence of Nero. The Romans knew their history, and they know that they were these incredibly tough periods where they just stood up when everyone else would have failed. And by reading that, by reading the stories, by reading all the anecdotes, and again, I'm going to make a bit about it, you will actually get to understand Stoicism a lot deeper than basically thousands of other people don't do. So that's depth, but then there's also breadth. And for this, let me give you an example about Japan. I love Japanese culture. I find it absolutely fascinating. I find the ethos of the Japanese nation just, again, fascinating, incredible. And like many others, I have been to Japan, I have studied Japanese, but then only in the last few years I started drilling down further than just the last modern times in Japan, and have been studying more of Japanese history and studying more of the, let's say, more ancient side of Japan. And what I realized is that Japan was already really Japanese already 800 years ago. So 700 years ago, 600 years ago, Japan was already what it is now. The culture of Japan was already embedded, and that was super interesting to see. For this, for example, I could recommend 2 books. The first one is Musashi, which is it's not an uncommon book. At least in Japan, it's sold, I think, like 100 million copies, but it's not so common out in the West. Maybe 1 or 2 of my friends have read it, but beyond that, no. And it's a fictional story of the Japanese swordsman Miyamoto Musashi, the legendary swordsman, one of the most famous, if not the most famous samurai in the history of Japan. And the book is full of anecdotes, full of stories about perfectionism, about the way of the samurai, how developing, how the attention to detail, also all those sides of Japanese history, they all come out massively in this book, and it's just so interesting. It's a very interesting story as well. So definitely recommended that, and look for similar books like that as well. And then there's a period in Japanese history called the period of unification, where you have 3 men, Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa. They're the 3 guys who then unified Japan after it had been a splinter set of feudal lords and so on for a long time. And in this period of unification, after this period of unification, which by itself is a fascinating story, includes invasion of Korea, includes a lot of crazy stuff, but out of this period of unification, you start seeing the seeds of what it becomes modern Japan. So where should you go and look for these uncommon or obscure even books? My suggestion is that you should look into 3 specific areas. The first one is that you should read the classics, and by this I mean Plato, Xenophon, Thucydides, Livy, Appian, and all the luminaries from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. I find that this is absolutely fascinating reading. The fact that we have books that have been written 2,000 years ago, sometimes almost 3,000 years ago, and we can still read that, we can still see with all the color, the anecdotes, the stories, it's absolutely fascinating. And again, this is what everyone was reading, even not far off ago. So we're talking about few decades ago, this was what everyone was reading, and now we have an explosion of books, and just people even forget about these ancient luminaries. And you will get an edge by reading these stories from the ancient world, because again, these have been curated over millennia, and it's just absolutely fascinating. A specific recommendation from my side is that, and they're even on the less uncommon side of old books, you should read Plutarch's biographies. He has a collection of the biographies from the what he calls Noble Romans and Noble Greeks, and it's one of the best books, if not one of the best ever, and you should definitely read that. This is, for example, the book that it said that Shakespeare used as an inspiration for example, his plays on Julius Caesar and so on. Then, talking about Julius Caesar, what about Julius Caesar's own writings from his conquest of Gaul, which is now modern-day France, and from the civil wars? We have the diary from Julius Caesar. It's again made for publicity back home, back in Rome, right? But then the fact that we actually have the writing from this guy, Julius Caesar, everyone hears about him. The fact that he lived more than 2,000 years ago, and we have his writing, and it's good and it's interesting. It's absolutely fascinating. So again, I just get emotional with the classics because I like it so much, right? But go and read the classics. There's so much. So if you don't like history, you might even find something else that is interesting. You have poems, satires, plays, and so on. There's a lot of value in that. And by reading these, again, stories that are fascinating, you will get an edge over everyone else. One thing to note about the classics as well is that because they have been written so long ago, they're free. There's no copyright on Julius Caesar's writing. There's no copyright on Xenophon. So you can find all that writing online for free. And again, like, you get the best books for free. There's no better deal than that. The second area I suggest you focus on is on the obscure books on a field. So for example, there's a lot of books about leadership. I can't even count the millions of books that are out on leadership out there. And if I would say, hey, you should read just one book on leadership, I would say read Richard Nixon's collection of biographies called Leaders. And this is a book where Nixon, the former US President Richard Nixon, he makes an assessment of Churchill, he makes of Nikita Khrushchev, he makes of Adenauer, Yoshida, and a lot of luminaries, a lot of leaders at the top of their game. And he does this as a peer. So we're not talking about that guy who's a biographer or a guy sitting on a desk who just writes books. We're talking about a guy who became US president, and he had a very tough way up and also way down as well. And he meets all these guys at the top of their game, and he writes about them, or he writes how they rise to power. He writes anecdotes of him handling negotiations with them and so on. And I find it absolutely fascinating. Again, What about, if we're talking about leadership in action, there's so much more stories and anecdotes in that book than any other book I have seen on leadership. And then, for example, what about artists? A lot of people get recommended the book The War of Art, and I think that's a good book for sure. But if you want to read more about, if you want to be an artist and you want to read more about stories of artists and so on, why not you read the medieval scholar or medieval artist Giorgio Vasari, who wrote hundreds of years ago on Michelangelo and one of the other luminaries of the Renaissance. So this is a guy who was an artist himself and met all these luminaries from the Renaissance and met them, and then wrote a collection of biographies a la Plutarch on these people. Fascinating reading, amazing. And again, I don't have any artist friends that have actually gone and read this book, and I think like, man, you should do that. Come on. The third area I suggest you focus on is finding obscure topics you're interested about that are at the same time super fun for you to read, super like you are very curious and you want to hear more about, but at the same time it's something that most people don't even know about. And in this case, I'll give you two examples. From my side, I have been fascinated now for a few years on Eastern Roman Empire and what's called the Byzantine Empire and their history. So this is an empire that goes from the 400s to the 1400s. And the fact that they survived in an environment that was the most hostile you can imagine, it's so interesting. It makes you think, okay, how did these guys survive for 1,000 years to Germans, Huns, Arabs, Vandals, you name it, Crusades? They went through all that and kept strong. And there's a great book about it that actually tries to explain this. It's called The Grand History of the Byzantine Empire. And when you look into longevity and how you can go as a lightweight against all these heavyweights, a lot of really good insights, a lot of great stories. I mean, there's even one called the last war between this Byzantine Empire and the last Persian dynasty called Sasanian dynasty from ancient Persia. And it's just so fascinating. It's one of the most amazing stories that makes you be like, I mean, until a very point, and then it's a real story. It's just fascinating. And the second point I'm reading at the moment as well is on history of religion. So for that, I have been digging into a book called A History of Religious Ideas. And this is a book as well that makes you understand, okay, there's so many things about religion that have been the same for thousands of years. That the way we think as humans, I mean, it just makes you go a lot more deep than you otherwise would in a topic like this. And it's, again, super interesting. I don't know how much it will help me for my job or my business, right? But then it does give me a lot of stories and insights that, sometimes when I have discussions about it, I do fascinate people in a way. Beyond that, so beyond these three areas, just a few more side thoughts as well. So there's great documents and letters from ancient times that you are still available now and you can read. So, I mean, we talk about Seneca's letters, we talk about Julius Caesar, but what, for example, like there's the correspondence that the Pope had with the great Khans from the Mongol Empire. So we're talking about also like hundreds of years ago. And the Pope is explaining to them why they need to become Christian. I mean, it's just fascinating stuff. I mean, the fact that we have that and it's easy to read and they're, again, all free, it's just super cool. So something that if you find it interesting, you should go and read that as well. Then there's the strategic manuals, operation manuals from the different empires and the different places. So everyone is reading, for example, The Art of War by Sun Tzu, but it's just one out of hundreds of these manuals that have been compiled through history. So, for example, talking about Eastern Roman Empire, there's one called the Strategicon that was written by the Emperor Maurice, and how then his army should be prepared, how they're going to be fighting versus nomadic horse archers, how they're going to be fighting against the Persians, and it's all in place there, and like leadership and so on. And it's, again, thousands of years ago that they write this, and it's absolutely fascinating. For that, for example, the also very famous Jacob podcast goes through a lot of these operational manuals themselves. And if you find something of one of these manuals that you actually find interesting yourself, why don't you, instead of just listening to the podcast, go and find the manual yourself and read it through. Again, absolutely incredible stuff as well. So to conclude, if you read the same everyone else is reading, you have the same insights and the same thoughts and the same ideas that everyone else has. So instead, get an edge by adding depth and adding breadth to your reading. Look for the classics, look for the uncommon books in the field, look for the uncommon areas that you are very interested about, the obscure areas that you're interested about, and find your books and find your reading there as well. Complement your Tim Ferriss's and Naval and so on with this information as well. And believe me, try this, read a few books, and you'll notice that you'll become a more interesting person to hang out with. You'll have more ideas and you would even say more fulfilled. So with that, thanks for being here. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you want me to do more of this edgy different type of videos, let me know in the comments, and thank you. See you next time.